Today's video sponsor is MSI. The new MSI B550 Gaming Carbon Wi-Fi motherboard and AMD Ryzen 9 3900X processor deliver a truly flagship experience for gaming, content creation, and productivity. Enjoy best-in-class features such as lightning quick PCIe Gen 4, the latest Wi-Fi 6, and 2.5 gigabits per second networking, a potent 12-phase VRAM, and 6-layer PCB design, all topped off with sleek carbon looks. Together with AMD's 12-core, 24-thread Ryzen 9 3900X processor, you've got yourself one killer setup that can do it all for many years to come. So what are you waiting for? Enjoy more cores and faster performance today via the links in the video description. Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed, Part 3, monthly Q&A. I don't think we actually got it in the right month, but let's not pay attention to that and let's just focus more on the fact that we've got questions to answer. But these are all from our lovely Patreon members who have signed up, and they've got access to our exclusive Discord chat for Patreon members only, and they've asked us a question in our question and answer tab for the monthly Q&As. And here we are. So we're going to share the answers with everyone on the channel because some of you may find these interesting, and we do that each month. So it's not a Patreon exclusive, just the
questions are exclusive, the answers are for everyone. Yeah.
The answers, just we put them out there. So I think we should probably jump into it. What do you reckon, Tim?
Let's go. Let's do it.
All right, question here that we're going to start with, and I am going to, as I often do, hand this one over to my friend Tim on the other end of the outside of the screen. He's like,
I'm in the real world.
We haven't worked that out yet. I'm in the upside down, otherwise known as Australia. Actually, you're there too. Anyway, before I get way too confused and keep waffling on, let's just get into it. Are you, Tim, quietly optimistic that big or biggest Navi will be poised to slot in between the 3080 and 3090? Also, will AMD ray tracing have much support when RDNA2 launches, or will it be implemented, I suppose, will it implement an entirely different system and hence be redundant in 2020?
There's not much of a gap between the 3080 and 3090 for gaming, so it'll be really interesting to see where Navi ends up. I think that they, as we've talked about before, AMD should have been planning for Nvidia to have a card that's as fast as the 3080. So if they're not around that mark, I think that would be pretty disappointing. So I'd certainly expect them to be around there. But again, it's AMD, so who knows? They've disappointed many times in the past with Radeon, so they might do that again. We'll just wait and see. But yeah, like I said, this slot in between the 3080 and 3090, again, there's not that, like 10% difference in performance. So it's possible that if they're sort of around that mark, that they could be very easily faster than both of those parts. Or maybe they're slower than both of those parts. There's just not much in it. So it will be hard to know until we get those cards. Will AMD ray tracing have much support? Again, we talked a little bit about this in the other Q&A sessions. I would expect that most games would be using the Microsoft DirectX ray tracing implementation, so they should just work. But again, it will really depend on whether games have been implementing NVIDIA proprietary RTX stuff, or we really don't know because there's been no way to test or know whether they have. So we'll see. We'll see on that one. I would expect that a lot of games would work, though. I think this next one is... I'm going to be passing this one off to you on this one.
Thank you.
Will you by any chance be able to get your hands on some of the 3080 or 3090 cards, such as non-OC variants, which were not sent out by AIB partners for review? I'd like to see reassurance that the clock speeds and or power draw on those isn't substantially worse than the 3080.
So this sort of speaks to, I suppose, cherry-picked review samples, which can go on. We definitely won't be buying a 3090 because it's like 3,000 Australian dollars. But having said that, we can't buy a 3080 either because there's no stock at this point in time. But let's say we're talking about down the track when stock's not an issue. It's something we could look at doing, but I don't think there's anything there. Like, that stuff gets exposed like really easily, really quickly. So, and based on what I'm seeing from people who have bought cards, looking at their videos of their clock speeds and the temperatures they're running and all that, I don't think there's anything in there. We've never seen that sort of thing in the past. I know all these sort of conspiracies come to the surface whenever there's a new generation, but yeah, I think the 3090s will be cherry-picked silicon. That'll be your better quality silicon, and the 3080s will, still working silicon, of course, but not as good. But I'm not expecting a to see anything there.
Next question. The 3090 Founders Edition showcases what Nvidia's flow-through cooler design can accomplish when it has comparable dimensions to AIB models. This design is leaked many months ago, but instead AIBs opted for heat sinks, marginally overhanging the PCB with rather small slits, perforations in the backplate, solutions that all seem inferior acoustically and thermally, at least on 3080s. Why didn't AIBs copy Nvidia's design for their top range of 3080s and 3090s? Yeah, what do you reckon?
Well, I've got a fair bit more information on this subject, which will be available. Actually, that video should have gone live before this one, so I can talk about it. Okay. So, first of all, why didn't AIBs go with a similar design to Nvidia's? Well, one of the reasons would be that it's extremely expensive. So, the designing the PCB and cramming everything together, not so much of an issue, though you do have to use much higher quality components than you would otherwise, so there is an increased cost there, I suppose. But the cooler itself, I've actually got the thing here. I mean, you guys will have seen the review. It's just absolutely massive, this thing, and it weighs 2.2 kilograms, so it is huge. It's like half a kilo, 500-ish grams heavier than the biggest, most premium AIB cards. So there's quite a bit of extra money there spent on the cooling. Yep. That's just a fact. So it would just be too expensive. I mean, they could do it. You'll certainly see some exotic 3090s and 3080s coming up in the future, and they'll just cost more. They can't achieve what Nvidia's achieved for the $1,500 US MSRP in the case of the 3090. Just not possible. They can't do it. So you're not going to see that. It'll be on cards that cost, over $100 more than MSRP. So that's one of the reasons. The other reasons, as we saw in my video, which would have been up on the channel last night, is that it's not technical. Well, it's not superior in all metrics. So as I found, and probably a lot of reviewers will have found, that the GPU die sensor reports very low GPU temperatures, and that's largely because it has a gigantic, massive heatsink on it, which is really doing a great job of sucking heat out of the die. But because you've crammed so many power stages and so many really hot GDDR6X memory chips together, the thermal density of that PCB is extremely high. So while you're sucking the heat out of one side of the PCB quite well on the GPU, the backside of the card is getting really hot. So your GDDR6X memory on the backside of the card, the PCB temperature behind the VRAM, all that kind of stuff is getting quite a bit hotter on the FE card because of that crammed together PCB design. So it's not, basically, as I was saying earlier, you probably have to spend more money on the components there, better quality power stages, capacitors and all that kind of stuff to deal with the extra thermal load. Whereas a brand, well, we've seen it with MSI already, they spread that stuff out quite a bit more. So whereas you see 1 mil at most between the inductors for the VRM and the memory modules, it's 1 mil on the FE card, you're looking at more 20 mil or so on the MSI card. And that just reduces the thermal density of the PCB, makes it way easier to cool, and you will have seen those results yesterday. But because Nvidia is only providing thermal sensors for the GPU, and most reviewers will probably look at the GPU temperature, they'll look at the fan speed, they'll look at the operating volume, most will conclude that the FE model is better than pretty much all AIB models, because it is, if you just look at those things. But if you manage to get some thermal probes in there, the PCB does get pretty bloody hot on the FE card. So yeah, not saying that's necessarily a problem, not saying it's going to cause crashing or reduce the lifespan of the card, but that is a drawback that you won't see on the MSI cards.
Next question is it possible for a graphics card to have two different types of memory, say use both HBM and GDDR? Would the current gen memory controllers be able to work with that? I think it would be possible to design a GPU that has both controllers in it. Whether or not they'd actually want to use both at the same time is another question. I think a lot of games would expect that if they are putting assets into the memory, that speed, all those assets could be accessible at the same speed. Whereas if you had sort of your HBM and then GDDR, you'd need to have some weird caching system built in. So the most frequently used assets are in the HBM and then not as frequently used as in GDDR. It would become very messy. sounds like a very messy solution, and whether that would be more beneficial, versus the cost of, it obviously costs more to go full HBM versus full GDDR. Are the complexities there worth the trade-off for price versus just full HBM? It becomes a very complex solution. So I don't think we'd see that too often in real-world designs. Now I've got a question that I think only you can answer, considering you've done this sort of testing. Does DLSS lower VRAM usage? If so, this could alleviate some concerns about 10 gigabytes of VRAM not being enough in certain scenarios. So thoughts on that? I would have thought that with DLSS rendering at a lower resolution that it would lower VRAM usage, wouldn't it?
That would be my assumption. I'll be perfectly honest. It's not something I've really looked into because VRAM usage gets confusing when you're talking about allocation creeping in there. And I think there are a few ways to get around that now. But yeah, not something I've really looked into, but I would imagine that it would I imagine it would lower VRAM usage because you're rendering at a lower resolution. And then I don't know if they're using any VRAM for the sort of upscaling technique or not, but I wouldn't have thought so. Could this alleviate concerns about 10 gigabyte? Well, if we're correct in our assumptions, then yeah, it could, but we're still talking about a limited selection of games here. So, and for those that are really concerned and they want ultra textures and the native image and all that, then that's, chucking them the DLSS bone's probably not going to satisfy them. But anyway, Tim, you call yourself a fan of ultra-wide monitors. Prove yourself. Prove that you're a fan. What did he actually going to say? And you even use one yourself. But you are still filming Hardware Unboxed reviews in peasant 16:9 aspect ratio. What gives? Yeah, 16:9 is peasant. Bring back 16:10. 16:10.
Well,
yeah.
I mean, just for you, we'll put this section in 21:9 aspect ratio for you. You can see what it's like. Maybe now we'll switch to 4:3 for you as well, just to mess around, with and annoy people.
Bit of a box.
Yeah, 16:9 makes sense. Let's be honest. So
yep,
I think that's
most
what we're using.
Yep, definitely. It's definitely the standard aspect ratio at this point, so that makes sense. All right, Nick says, Steve, Tim, get out the crystal ball. So I think he just means Tim then. Given the 3080 is still brute forcing ray tracing with its monolithic die, do you think AMD can take a different approach and get better DirectX ray tracing performance out of RDNA2 and the new consoles? What do you reckon, Tim?
I mean, again, we don't really know. It's definitely possible. I think this will be a really interesting point to look into with next generation RDNA GPUs, because we're going to have a situation where, we're kind of going to have a reasonable idea from the specs based on how it's going to perform versus older cards, where it's going to slot into the lineup. But AMD might have a much better way to accelerate ray tracing. So if that's the case, you potentially have a card that is not as good value for, say, general computing, but then is really good at ray tracing. And that could present a whole bunch of very interesting things in the market. I think they're definitely not going to have the exact same approach as Nvidia. Based on some of the console disclosures, it looks like they're doing a very different approach. So we'll just have to wait and see how that one plays out in terms of the performance. But yeah, they'll definitely be using a different approach. So yeah, how that translates to performance, we'll find out soon.
All right, next one here. Why don't manufacturers like Nvidia release all of the lineup at the same time? I would have thought making people hold out would hurt sales when the hype is greatest. So, I don't really have I haven't researched this or asked people in the industry, but some reasons that I imagine would be valid is that there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of logistics in releasing a product. And releasing an entire product line in one go just isn't practical, probably isn't feasible. And we've seen with the RTX 3080, just that launch alone on a new architecture, a new process node, a whole lot of changes there that we've seen some teething issues. And if they'd released the 3070, the 3060, and all these other cards along with that, and they had other different teething issues, it'd just be a gigantic mess that would be really difficult for them to fix in a timely manner. So there's that aspect of it. It's also the same thing applies to AIBs. They've been rushed. We've already seen the capacitor issue with select models. They were rushed to create those. There's no way you could also throw on their plate, 4, 5, 6 other models as well. It's just not possible. So that'd be another reason. And then there's the shipping and all that sort of stuff. And also these products, while they're of the same architecture, they're physically different silicon. So they've got to ramp up production. So we've already seen how bad supply is for the GA102 die, but they've got to create all these other smaller dies as well. And there's a whole lot that goes into it. So it's just not possible for them to release a whole product line at once. If it was, they probably would, because they would get more sales initially.
I'm not sure that they would. I think part of it as well comes down to they want to hype
keeping it going.
They want to hype the top end product. Like we always see the companies launch the sort of best high end product that they've got first. So I think they want a situation where people look at that card and they're like, oh, I must have that card, even if it's $700 or whatever. Because if there was like a 3060 on the market, for example, then perhaps some people wouldn't be as tempted to buy a 3070 or 3080 if they know that there's this 3060 that's perfectly fine for them. It's much more affordable. They really want to drive sales to the high end first, get as many people sucked in, being like, oh, I've got to have the new thing, got to get the best of the best. And then you slowly release the other products, and then people who are more okay with waiting and buying mid-range cards can do so. So I think a lot of the things about the supply is valid. I don't think that they would be able to launch all the cards at once, but I think the way they do it works out pretty well for them in terms of getting as many sales into the high end as they can. It
works out well with some benefits. I think overall they would see more sales purely for the fact that there's more products to sell.
Yeah.
And while I agree with what you're saying, I think that most people who have they have $700 at the ready and they want an RTX 3080, they're not gonna have a moment of clarity and go, oh, but hang on a minute, I could get away with the cheaper $500 3070, maybe I'll just do that. That'll apply to a small percentage of the people that have their hearts set on a 3080, I would say. But yeah, that's certainly a factor. I think the other factor that plays to their advantage is the fact that it keeps the hype train going. Like people who want a 3080, well, probably haven't got one, but they're still trying to get one. And then the 3070 will come along, and the people with $500 is sort of their max budget, then they'll grab one, and it just keeps the hype train going to an extent. I think it'll sort of wear off once you get past the 3060. That's generally where people sort of a bit, even though there's more sales for the $200-ish cards, it's just generally people don't get as excited as they do with the flagship products because they're flagship products. But anyway, that's pretty much our take on it, I think.
Yep. All right. Next question. I'm curious for your 2 cents on supply side Big Navi Radeon GPU availability. If we assume AMD deliver with Zen 3, demand is likely to grow. More OEMs will join the fold. Zen 2 dies are about 80 square millimeters, whereas 5700 has a 250 square millimeter die, and Big Navi could be, say, 500 square millimeters. Seems like in this scenario, AMD is better off making more CPUs and capitalizing on Intel's weakness. The chiplets are smaller, easy to produce, and make a better profit case per square millimeter. Thus, Big Navi will be hard to come by, at least at first, as AMD allocates supply to CPUs. I mean, there's a lot of really fair points in this question, or in this sort of more statement thoughts question going on here. So yeah, if they're able to get better profit per die space on a CPU than they are on a GPU, then I would imagine that they would prioritize that chip. But there gets to a point where they can only sell so many CPUs, and they have to consider many other things as well. Like, they can't just let their GPU division die because those chips aren't as profitable as selling more CPUs. They want to be competitive across many things because that may help them in the future as well, helps them with competition, does a whole bunch of things. So I would expect that, yeah, they may prioritize Zen 3 more at launch, but I would say that they would still be very keen on getting good supply for Big Navi. I think they've indicated a little bit that that's more what they're at least hoping to do with this launch. I think as well, there's no guarantee that they'd be making more on a CPU than necessarily on a GPU, even if it's like 500 square millimeters. They definitely could be making a tidy profit on that, and they can sell GPUs for more than they can CPUs. Not as many people are going to be interested in spending $500 on a 12-core CPU when they could just buy a Ryzen 5 for $200, whereas those we've seen $500 GPUs, $700 GPUs are very attractive buys for a lot of people. So yeah, it'd be an interesting one to see where that goes with their supply situation.
All right, this question is aimed at you, Tim. With LTT's latest video on 11th gen mobile Intel, he, as in I believe Linus, states because of engineering constraints, they will be quoting sustained power numbers versus thermals. What is your opinion on this, given this was within an Intel-focused video and Intel's recent sponsoring of LTT staff build-outs? I'm not suggesting foul play, but the selective reporting of data seems a bit convenient with the new chip design and nanometer size change.
Yeah, I disagree with most of what this question is sort of angling at. I think this question asker is sort of going, oh, maybe it's a bit dodgy that they're doing this based on the sponsored video stuff. I think that a lot of reviewers have been sort of doing the wrong thing in not reporting power numbers when they're testing mobile CPUs. A lot of the time they just sort of brush it off or more focus on things like thermals. But what we've seen is that a lot of laptops just run super hot all the time, like 100 degrees Celsius. And if they don't do that, they're leaving performance on the table. So what becomes much more important is how much power they're using, because that really tells you, in terms of comparisons, like if a chip is using more power but also performs better, how does that compare to a chip that uses less power but performs worse? Or maybe a lower power design can have more performance than a higher power design. We've seen that with, say, AMD's Zen 2 processors in the mobile space, for example. So I think going with these sustained power numbers makes much more sense than thermals for testing laptop designs, especially as we move to more stuff just hitting the thermal limits consistently. So yeah, I think that's a really good thing. I don't think it's an Intel sort of telling people to do this or, sponsoring people to do it that way. I just think it's the way that should be done. It's the way we've been doing it for a while now. And yeah, no foul play. We'll be testing it in that sort of way as well.
Time for Tim to use his crystal ball. I hope you've got that handy, Tim. Do you foresee the upcoming Ryzen launch being smoother than the RTX 3080 launch? Before you address your crystal ball, you'll have to do it with another one, because the other question from another member is, do you foresee upcoming RDNA2 launch being smoother than the 3080 launch? So...
Again, what are my predictions thinking today? I'm going to go...
Basically, do you think AMD are going to do a better job with their launches than Nvidia did with the 3080?
So based on past history, I'd say that the Ryzen launch is more likely to go smoothly compared to the RDNA2 launch. So I think if I was picking one of these to be smoother than the RTX 3080 launch, I'd expect the Ryzen launch to be pretty smooth. Zen 2 was a fairly smooth launch. There's always going to be motherboard BIOS update issues and that sort of thing. But I think for things like stock, for example, I would expect that you'd be able to buy a Zen 3 CPU easier than buying an RTX 3080, especially because a lot of the lineup will come out at once. Yep. So I'd expect that to be fairly reasonable. With RDNA2, though, again, it could go so many different ways because we've seen so many different, maybe they'll change the spec last minute again, like with the 5600 XT. That would not be a good situation. Maybe they'll have virtually no stock, like with some of the past Vega launches, for example. Maybe they'll have driver issues. These are all sorts of things we've seen in the past, so they'd really need to be pulling out all the stops to prevent that from happening. But I think AMD seems pretty content to sit back and wait. They're not keen on, or not as interested in being first. So they've let Nvidia go first. So when they sort of sit back and do that sort of thing, I would expect that if you're content being second, then you should be spending more time getting these things right. So I would hope, based on that it would be smoother, but again, we really just don't know. I would expect availability to be better, but potentially drivers to be an issue. I don't know. Who knows?
With or without the acquisition of ARM, do you see Nvidia ever establishing their own foundry? Would they ever need/want to? I don't think so.
Very difficult to establish a foundry from scratch at this point. If anything, they might buy like a global foundries type business or one of those sort of smaller players. Because if they started establishing a foundry now, how many years would it be until that's viable? Like it would be
it's not going to happen.
So much R&D investment. I just don't think that new foundries coming into play like that is going to be a thing too often. So can't see it happening. All right, final question here. With DLSS 2.0 and 2.1 giving Nvidia massive advantages in supported titles, it seems to me that it should be a main focus for AMD to compete against. that got me wondering, how difficult would it be for Team Red to come up with a comparable technology? How long do you expect we would have to wait for such a thing if we will get one anytime soon? So I don't think it would be that difficult to come up with this sort of technology. To me, it doesn't really seem like it would necessarily require like tensor cores or any specific hardware. You would just design it around the hardware that you had in your GPU. So I would totally expect that it's possible from a technological perspective. I think as well we've seen some things like Microsoft Direct ML, which I think is like direct machine learning that potentially could be used for something like this running on a GPU while gaming. So I'd expect that they would compete. As for how long, who knows? Maybe they'll announce it next month with the RDNA2 stuff. Maybe they're still working on it. But if DLSS becomes more and more used in titles, they will need to have a competing feature. And I've said in the past, I'm not sure whether it was on the 3080 Q&A that we did or some other video, that I would expect that eventually this will become like an industry standard feature somewhere, whether it's like a DirectX thing or Direct ML or something like that. That there will just be an industry standard like machine learning upscaling thingo. Everyone will use it. DLSS will go away. AMD's proprietary thing will go away, and everyone will just use this new feature. Potentially a fair way down the track on that. Could be many, many years. But this is just, very new technology. So, I expect them to compete. We'll see.
Okay, well, that does it for all of the Patreon questions, at least that we had time for. There were a few more in there. But,
so many this month. So many. Lots of people were signing up lately. Lots of great questions. Yeah.
We'll answer those ones privately on Discord or something like that, so everyone gets their question answered. But we only have so much time that we can film and cram all of these into a video, and this video is probably fairly long as it is.
Yep.
But anyway, thank you very much to our lovely Patreon members for asking their questions and engaging on our Discord chat and supporting the channel directly. Much appreciated. And of course, thank you to everyone else as well who watched this content, because we also do very much appreciate that. And I don't know, Tim, what else? Are we missing anything?
No, I think that's it.
That's it. So do the likes, do the YouTube stuff. I'm not even going to say it, we say it all the time. But yeah, just thank you very much for watching and becoming part of the 20% Club.
Yep.
And I'm your host, Steve.
I'm your host, Tim.
We'll see you again next time.